Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm Crosby Kemper, the director of the Kansas City Public Library. It's a pleasure to have you all here. A couple of bits of business. If you would all turn off your cell phones or other devices, that would be great. Appreciate that. So there'll be no interruption of our brilliant conversation tonight. Secondly, I would like to tell you that after the event, you may have seen her out there before the event, Heidi Nast, KC Studio Magazine, is out there signing people up to get your free copy, your free subscription to KC Studio, which we're promoting because they promote us as well as other arts and education organizations, cultural organizations in Kansas City, major organizations, and we're in every month. We've got a little something about us every month to do a cultural calendar. It's a great addition to your knowledge of the cultural scene in Kansas City. It's free, and if you sign up for it, it helps them and therefore us keep their first-class postage rate. So please think about doing that. And I also noticed that there are probably a lot of people for whom this might be the first time in the library, the first-timers in the library, quite a few of you. Yeah, great. So two things I want to mention. You can sign up to get on our mailing list, email and or snail mail lists. We can send out our calendar to you, our wonderful extensive calendar. Well, I'll show that to you in a minute. And we do an email blast every Sunday afternoon telling you what the next couple of weeks events are going to be. And we've got a lot of great events coming up. And so now I'm going to segue to mentioning a couple of upcoming events. But I'm going to preface that by telling you about the sponsorship tonight and our overall program. We're very proud of what we think of as our civic engagement in the library, about the discussion of issues, both local issues, our relationship with the Citizens Association and the Civic Council and the Downtown Council and many other organizations promoting discussions of major issues in Kansas City. But we also are very interested in national issues, and those of you who are regular attendees know that we've had lots of people left, right, and center, and sometimes further left and sometimes further right, and absolutely dead center. Well, not dead, but, you know, though sometimes, well, won't go there. Tonight's event is co-sponsored with the National Review Institute, and you can find, there's information out there. Lindsay Craig of the National Review Institute is standing at the back of the room. We'll be out there afterwards. You can find out more about it. National Review, as you know, is the leading magazine on the right, opinion magazine on the right in the United States, we've established a formal relationship to bring National Review authors and editors in to talk about issues, talk about their books, talk about what they're up to at National Review. And the National Review Institute has been created to sponsor this and to bring people into regional partnerships and regional events like ours. And we're glad that they're going to have a formal relationship with us. We also have a relationship we have just created with the Nation and the Nation Institute on the left, a similar position on the left to National Review's on the right. You will know that we've had some National Review authors like Jay Nordlinger as an example in the library before, and we've had Nation authors like Chris Hedges and others before as well. But we have now a formal relationship, which we're proud with both. And we hope that you'll take the time, no matter what your political views are, to find out what they have to say. And if your political views are consonant, that you might show some support for them as well in one way or another, and develop our dialogue as we go along. And to show that we're developing this, I do want to mention that John Nichols, who's the Washington correspondent of the Nation, will be in the library on May 22nd. And we're happy to have him do that. He's regular on MSNBC, which actually I think Kevin's also sometimes on MSNBC, showing how we're all interested in dialogue. And I do want to mention a couple of other upcoming programs. I specifically want to tell you about a great program we have on April 3rd here at the Central Library. I think the best younger, it's all relative, she looks young to me anyway, American historian of the West, Anne Hyde, whose Bancroft Prize-winning book, Bancroft Prize being the historian's leading prize in the United States, Empire, Nations, and Families, A History of the North American West, which sort of includes the west from Kansas City to the west and to the north. It's a brilliant book, and she is, I think, as I say, the best younger American historian of the West, and she'll be here on April 3rd at the Central Library. And I also want to point out the cover of our April calendar has got Hillary Clinton on the cover. It says, "Can anyone stop her?" We've already had one relatively incoherent letter of protest that's thinking we might be sponsoring Hillary Clinton for president here at the library. I do want to point out that this program is part of our continuing series that we're doing with David Von Drehle. David, as you know, a prize-winning journalist who's worked for the Washington Post, been an assistant managing editor of the Washington Post, is now Time Magazine's roving national correspondent, has done a series of interviews with other journalists on topics of the day. Been a great series. And he'll be interviewing another friend of the library who's been here before a couple of times, Carl Cannon, a very well-known Washington journalist, covered the White House for many, many years. And they'll be talking about Hillary Clinton and the likelihood, the possibility, the probability, depending on your point of view and your knowledge of the facts, that she might become our next president. And that'll be an interesting conversation. So sign up and get on our mailing list if you're not on our mailing list. And you can also join the Friends of the Library for $25 and support us that way. It's the best deal in town. And thank you. So, thank you. Now, I want to introduce Kevin, but first I have to tell you, Kevin, as some of you will know, and all of you will find out, Kevin is from Texas. He is Texas's ambassador to New York City. His credentials have not yet been accepted by Bill de Blasio. But he does live in New York. He's the author, of course, of this fabulous book, which you can buy outside, and I'm sure you'd be happy to sign copies later too, Kevin. The end is near, and it's going to be awesome. Now, I'm not going to tell you why it's going to be awesome, because Kevin will tell you that. But I will tell you that Kevin is one of the great libertarian-leaning journalists of our time. He's been editor of the Philadelphia Bulletin. He had a career in newspaper journalism for a long time, showing that libertarians don't always figure out what the market is all about. He runs a blog, the Exchequer blog, which is one of the best political and economics oriented blogs. He worked for the Bombay-based Indian Express newspaper group, he's been on MSNBC and NPR. He wrote the Politically Incorrect Guide to Socialism, contributed chapters to a book called The New Leviathan, the State versus the Individual in the 21st Century. And I have to say, I think this is a fabulous book. It is very well written. Kevin, as you'll find out, if you don't already know, is very, very witty, but he's also very, very strongly philosophically grounded. And while I don't agree with everything, I do think a guy who points out that the market doesn't always work by telling us about Clairol's touch of yogurt shampoo is a guy who I think has got his feet on the ground. And you can believe what you want about gay marriage or the bailout of the financial companies, but one of the primary points of Kevin's book is that it's a variation on what you may remember Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said: everybody's entitled to their opinion, but not their own opinion, but not their own facts. And I think Kevin has a phrase in the book: reality is not optional. And this is he talks a lot about ideological frameworks in the book, and the failure of ideological frameworks on both the right and the left, including the folks that he and I admire, the free marketeers. Again, the touch of yogurt shampoo. The market doesn't always work, though he's primarily focused, of course, on the government not always working, or mostly not working well. And I have to say, I have one objection to the book, one strong objection to the book, and that is his view of contemporary libraries. And that is, he talks about, he has an interesting historically based, correct view of how libraries were initially mostly funded privately, were started by private groups. The first library west of the Mississippi was the Mercantile Library, which is still a membership library in St. Louis, for instance. It's still a great library, wonderful library. And that they became professionalized as they became public. Library budgets ballooned, and volunteer society ladies were displaced by graduate school credentialed professionals in the faintly ridiculous field of library science. I agree with that part anyway. Our libraries were transformed from quiet places to read a book into psychiatric wards. And so I want you as an audience today to disprove his view of public libraries in this part of the country. So with those of you who have recently left the psychiatric ward, please move over to this, sorry. Seriously, I think this is a wonderful, witty, and brilliant book, despite his rather jaundiced view of libraries, which we'll disprove tonight. And ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Kevin Williamson.
Thanks. I have a little bit of a cough, so. For the record, I'd like to point out that Clairol's Touch of Yogurt shampoo is not what's responsible. It's bad genes. Well, thank you all for having me out here. It's been a pleasure being out here. We came out early yesterday and ate some burn-ins and did all that good Kansas City stuff. So it was a lot of fun, and I'm glad to be here. I like to be at libraries in general because I'm sort of a book guy. But I think, it's important in a sense for me to be here because, when times are hard and the economy is uncertain and there's a Russian army on the march in Europe, the world cries out with one voice, "My God, is there a theater critic in the house?" So I'm glad to be here in any case. So I'm actually going to do you all a favor in a sense and not really talk very much about my book because it's all written down. So you can go out and read it, and it'll be fine. Well, I'm going to talk about mostly is language and politics and the intersection of the two. People sometimes ask me, because of my column where I studied economics, and I always kind of have to say, I didn't. My brother actually was an economics major. I studied poetry and literary criticism and linguistics. And my primary interest is in language and specifically how language and politics intersect. And if you're going to give a talk about politics in the English language, of course you run into George Orwell's famous essay by that very title. There's just no way around it. And I promise not to read to you too much, but I did want to read to you a couple of sentences from it because it'll give you a good idea of where I'm starting. Orwell writes, "Most people who bother with the matter at all would admit that the English language is in a bad way, but it is generally assumed that we cannot by conscious action do anything about it. Our civilization is decadent, and our language, so the argument runs, must inevitably share in the general collapse. It follows that any struggle against the abuse of language is a sentimental archaism, like preferring candles to electric light or hansom cabs to aeroplanes. Underneath this lies the half-conscious belief that language is a natural growth and not an instrument which we shape for our own purposes." On the subject of sentimental archaisms, I like the presence of the word aeroplanes in that sentence, and hansom cabs. Things do age quickly in language. As has already been alluded to, I began my journalism career in India, specifically in Bombay. And when I tell people I first started working in Bombay, inevitably the thing that happens is that someone tries in a very subtle way to correct me. And they'll say, "Oh, how did you like being in Mumbai?" Which is the official name of the city. And there's always this little bit of sort of smug self-congratulation when people say that. It's a combination of being a smart, sophisticated, informed person, but also the right kind of person, who is sensitive to the cultural habits of wherever. But there's a lot more to the Mumbai thing than people know. And for the I thought I saw a few people of South Asian origin in the audience, and I'm going to apologize for my pronunciations in advance, but it's actually kind of an interesting story, and it's a good example of the intersection between language and politics. So there are actually two national languages in India. One is English, and the other is Hindi. And both of these are foreign languages to the vast majority of people in the country. Most Indians don't speak Hindi, particularly in the south of the country, where they speak languages that are part of an entirely separate linguistic group. And they've always thought of the Hindi people speaking in Delhi as the kind of, meddlesome, self-important elites in the north. In fact, in the south of the country, if you put up a street sign in Hindi, people will tear it down. So English ends up being the sort of default language. But when I was there was an interesting thing that happened, which is in the mid-1990s, India elected as its prime minister a man named H.D. Deve Gowda, who will not go down in the history books because he was totally inconsequential and no one remembers him. But he was important for one reason. He was the first prime minister they'd ever elected who didn't speak Hindi. He was from a rural, agrarian, southern party, kind of like the Republicans in a sense. But anyway, he didn't speak Hindi, and he gave a lot of speeches in English. And there was a picture in my newspaper one day of a nationalist protester at one of his talks holding up a big placard, and the placard said, "Don't force English on Hindi-speaking people." So it ended up being kind of a thing for him. And so after a few months of furious study and tutoring, he gave his first speech in Hindi, and it was a fiasco because he was terrible. It'd be like me trying to give a speech in Italian after, studying it for a couple of weeks. It was just awful, and everyone, made fun of him for it. And the next day we had a cartoon in the paper of the same guy with the placard, and it said, "Don't force Hindi on Hindi-speaking people," which I like. So Bombay, or Mumbai if you prefer, is in the Indian state of Maharashtra, where the mother tongue is Marathi. I don't know if you know this, but Indian states were mostly mapped out according to language, which is sort of a proxy for ethnicity. So where the Gujarati-speaking people were, became Gujarat, and the Punjabi-speaking people became Punjab, Bengali people in West Bengal, etc. So there are 22 languages in India with official status in one or more regions, and there are 30 languages that are spoken by at least 1 million people. And in the 1961 census, and for some reason, as far as I know, this is the last time they counted it up, but there were 1,652 languages being spoken in India at the time. So I kind of didn't feel so bad about not learning Hindi, and it was hard. So language is very much a political issue there, and especially in Maharashtra. So the English word for that state's largest city is Bombay. The Hindi word is almost the same word. It's Bombay. Almost. And the Marathi word is Mumbai. Mumbai sounds a little bit like Bombayim, which is probably a horrible pronunciation as well, but that's what the Portuguese called the city when they were the colonists there, and it means nice little port, which apparently it used to be. And there are a few other names. And so I don't speak Hindi. I sure as heck don't speak Marathi, but every time I hear someone say Mumbai, I think of that Dos Equis commercial with the most interesting man in the world, And it's the one where he says, unless we are going to conduct the entire conversation in Spanish, probably best not to open with hola. In American politics, we throw around the word fascist a lot, which is kind of dumb, but we do, and any conservative out there, me among them, will get called a fascist a lot. I'm part of a political tendency that would be perfectly happy to see gay couples using assault rifles to defend their marijuana farms from the tax man. But when the nation comes here next month, I'm the fascist. Don't know why. So my friend and colleague Jonah Goldberg wrote a pretty good book called Liberal Fascism, which takes its name from an essay by H.G. Wells in which he used those precise words. And he was calling for the establishment of an authoritarian, totalitarian movement, sort of like Nazism, except the idea would be that it would impose enlightened liberal values. And I'm not really sure how that was supposed to work out, honestly. But the point being here that we don't have a lot of actual fascists in American politics. Bombay, on the other hand, is and has for a long time been governed by an actual fascist party. They're called the Shiv Sena, which, again, the language tells us something. Shiv Sena means Shivaji's army. Shivaji was a 17th century warrior king in Maharashtra and he fought for the independence of his Hindu kingdom from the Muslim occupiers in the Mughal Empire. And he insisted on the use of Marathi rather than Persian, which was the standard language at the time in court business and official documents. He handed the Mughals a number of embarrassing military defeats, and he's generally regarded as, the stand-up badass Hindu who stopped the Muslim invaders. It's not entirely true, but that's kind of the legend. So he's sort of the Charles Martel of Marathi lore. And if you know who Charles Martel is, there are French far-right groups called the Charles Martel Brigades, which are anti-Muslim groups, and they exist to basically beat guys up in the street. So the Shiv Sena named themselves after this guy for approximately the same reason. Shiv Sena is a descendant of an organization called the RSS, which stands for words I won't even attempt to pronounce. And we know that organization best because it's the organization that produced the man who assassinated Mohandas Gandhi. That's basically what it's known for. And they also wear these ridiculous sort of fascist uniforms with little khaki shorts and hats. And like the black shorts in the Jeeves books, funny English fascists. They're kind of like those guys, but except real and awful and terrible. So it was the Shiv Sena when they came to power who insisted on changing the official name of Bombay to Mumbai and insisted that people used it. And the reason they did that was, one, that's the Marathi word, but two, it's also a religious name. Mumbai refers to Mumba Devi, a Hindu goddess. So it was basically a way for this angry fascist political party full of right-wing political zealots to raise their middle finger at the national government, at religious minorities, at ethnic minorities, at linguistic minorities, and foreigners, and especially to Muslims. And so, of course, all of the enlightened, sensitive, politically correct people in the West now adopt this language as well because, we want to be nice. And so when you say Mumbai, in a sense, you accept and adopt their agenda, whether you know it or not, in much the same way that people who unthinkingly refer to what we used to call Burma as Myanmar or Rangoon as Yangon, people who refer to the country governed by these awful people in Tehran as an Islamic republic, as though they represent some sort of legitimate expression of that. Language matters. And it gets kind of silly in Bombay sometimes. When I was first there, I had my official map, so it's got all the formal legal names of things on it. And I went to a taxi driver, and I asked him to take me to Chahapatri Shivaji railway station. And probably didn't even say it that well then. And he looked at me like, I was a Martian. He was like, huh? And I thought it was my pronunciation, so I kind of worked on it. And eventually I learned how to pronounce it. In fact, I learned how to pronounce it exactly the way the locals pronounce it in Bombay. Do you want to hear it? Yes. Victoria Terminus. So you can pass laws, but people are going to do what they're going to do. So there's a certain power in language, though, because language really helps us to create the concepts and categories by which we understand the world. Now, you've all heard the story, which turns out, unfortunately, not to be true, but it's still a great story about how Eskimo languages have 50 or 100 words for snow, and each one of them refers to some different kind of snow. Shockingly, not true. It should be true. In fact, the Nunavut languages have about as big a vocabulary for snow as English does. But there are some things like that that are true. For instance, in some Asian and South Pacific languages, and if I'm not mistaken, in Arabic, the word that a husband uses for his wife's parents is different from the word that a wife uses for her husband's parents. Now, in English, we would just say in-laws, but they have different words for it because they have very different sorts of relationships. So in English, there's no word for the special duty that a wife owes to her husband's parents that's kind of different and more formal and demanding than whatever special duty a husband owes to his wife's parents. And the reason we don't have the word is because we don't have the idea, we don't have the thing, we don't have the concept. But even though we don't have the relationship, it's kind of hard for us to talk about it because we literally don't have a word for that thing. So it's not like German where we just build new words all the time. German is kind of awful that way. But also sort of awesome. My favorite German word I read once is Hotentoten Potentaten Aten Otter, which is he who assaults the aunt of a Hottentot potentate. You don't use it a lot. But we don't always talk about that sort of relationship. And when we think analytically, when we think socially, when we think politically, we think in language. English is, in fact, a little bit like one of those old Civil War or World War II battlefields you can visit and still see the scars and marks of previous battles, because English was essentially born in occupation and conquest. The British Isles by the Romans, then after Constantine III pulled the Romans out, and there was essentially a 1,000-year-long tribal war in Britain between the Picts and the Gaels and all sorts of people. And eventually the Germanic invaders from the south that we now call the Anglo-Saxons, which is kind of where English comes from. And then the Anglo-Saxons in turn were conquered by the French-speaking Normans. And the interesting thing about that is to this day there exists in the English language a really sharp socioeconomic division between the old Anglo-Saxon words and the ruling class Latinate French words. For some reason the most famous examples all have to do with food, which we just had barbecue, so maybe that's just on my mind. But so for instance, cow is an Anglo-Saxon word, but beef is a French word. The idea being that the poor Saxon serf nobody farmers might have seen a cow, and they might have had cows in their domestic relationships, but their French-speaking rulers just saw beef. They didn't know what cow was, they just knew what showed up on their plates. So there are similar things, like the word hen is Anglo-Saxon, but the word poultry is French. The word deer is Anglo-Saxon, but the word venison is French. And there's some other weird variations on that too. One of them that I kind of like is that the word wisdom is Anglo-Saxon, but the word prudence is French. And it kind of feels right for the French, in a sense. Perhaps the most relevant of these, at least for the subject of politics, is that the word diplomacy comes to us from the French, but the word war is Anglo-Saxon. So people, experience things in different ways. So we're Normans in Parliament, and we're Saxons in bed, because all of our profanity is Anglo-Saxon, if you go back and look at it. So there's, is that too risque? There's an idea that goes back to Plato, at least, in the beginning of philosophy, but it's older than that. Before we had philosophy, we had religion. Before we had religion, we had magic and superstition. And if you explore any of those traditions far enough back, true across cultures and across times, from the classical Greeks to the autumn period Chinese to the prehistoric Mohegan Indians of North America, you come across this idea, and that is that the beginning of virtue is in wisdom, and the beginning of wisdom is in learning to call things by their correct names, as Confucius put it. It's an interesting idea. It shows up everywhere from scientific taxonomy to novels of Boris Pasternak. There's a certain power in names. In some older cultures, it was common for men to have common names that they used in public and that everyone knew, and then secret names that only they knew and maybe a few members of their family. Their wives and kids might not even know their real names as they were thought of. And this was pure, primitive, magical thinking, that if someone knew your real name, then he knew something important about you and he had some sort of power over you. There's all sorts of superstitions regarding names, that you can't put a curse on someone if you don't know their real name, or you can't put a hex on someone if you don't know their real name. I think this is why gods have so many names, because they're supposed to represent and personify, a lot of different realities. So there are, 1,000 names for Vishnu, but among the Hebrews, the true name of God was of course, a secret. Which brings us to the subject of politics, which I guess is what I'm really here to talk about. And what I'll put before you is this. I think that it is time that we start to call politics by its true name. When I was teaching, I used to sometimes ask my students to define government, define the state. Just give me a definition for it. Never could. And they were pretty smart kids. I didn't have dumb students. I was lucky that way. It just wasn't something they could do. They'd never thought about it. And I kind of think they couldn't come up with a definition for the same reason that a fish can't come up with a definition for water. They don't know what water is, it's just there. You live in it, you swim in it. They never had a good answer. So what we really need here is the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, who wrote, of each particular thing ask, what is it in itself? What is its nature? So what is a state and what does it do? In 2012, before the presidential election, the Democratic National Committee put out this campaign video. And it contained a sentence that became sort of infamous later, which was, government is the one thing we all belong to. Now, you've heard the word libertarian used and associated with my name, and it's probably sort of right-wing anarchist. But if you really want to creep out someone like me, that's the sentence to do it with, right? Because I'm sorry, Mr. President, I don't actually belong to you. I'm not property. I don't belong to anything. I belong to myself if I belong to anything. And if anything, government belongs to me, not the other way around, because we are citizens and not subjects. The government exists at our sufferance, not the other way around. But we take this sort of thing to be true, and we listen to it, and it's an important question to ask. Are we going to be citizens or are we going to be subjects? It's important to call things by their real names. So what is the state? I mean, if you really want to understand what government is, and this is kind of the first chapter of my book, which I said I wasn't going to talk about too much. If you want to understand what government is, you have to understand what government does. What is its role? So there are a few things you have to answer to talk about that. One is that almost all governments have geographic features. They have borders. They operate in particular territories. Now, borders are subject to change, as Ukrainians recently found out. And sometimes no one does a thing about it. But they generally have a particular geographic footprint. They're associated with particular places. Governments are always unique institutions in their societies, which is to say that they have powers and roles that no one else in society does. So anybody can sell you a hot dog. Anybody can provide you with a babysitter. Anybody in society can do lots of different things. Any of you can start a church if you want to. And I hear it's a good racket. But it's by nature, government is the only thing that does the things that government does. It's whatever powers it claims for itself, it claims uniquely. No other institution in society is allowed to have those. Well, what are its powers? Well, the one we run into most often is that it can take your property, and kind of likes to, as it seems. They can command you to pay tribute in the form of taxes, but it does other things as well. Can put you in prison. And depending on where you live, maybe it'll put you in prison because it doesn't like stuff that you like to smoke, or maybe it puts you in prison if you're in a different country because it doesn't like what you're going to read or what you're going to write. But whether it's a good government, I think we have a pretty good one. I'm pretty hard on the U.S. government, but I've lived a lot of places, and as governments go, it's not so bad. So it can take your property, can put you in prison, it can kill you, and they do that sometimes, whether in police altercations or in capital punishment, or now apparently with the drone assassinations of U.S. citizens abroad. In the case of Anwar al-Awlaki, anyway, he was sort of an awful guy, but really assassinating people for what they put on Facebook, I'm not so sure about that. And of course, they can also compel you to kill others by conscription, putting you in the army, fighting wars, that kind of thing. So if you look at these things, you have a geographic entity that has unique powers it claims for itself that no one else can have, and all those powers are based on force or the use of force. So another way to define that, which my students never got to, is that what a government is a regional monopoly on violence. Now, people don't like those words because we're trained not to like the word monopoly, and we're trained not to like the word violence, but that's what a state is. It's a regional monopoly on violence. It's the guy who can kill you and everyone takes it away and says, it's okay. Now, before I get going on too far, I'd like to emphasize that I don't, in spite of the loadedness of those words, I don't think violence is always inherently immoral and wrong. I mean, it wasn't moral suasion that freed the slaves. And incidentally, it wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation either. It was General Sherman who freed the slaves. It wasn't harsh language that stopped Hitler and ended the Holocaust. And it's not virtue that keeps you safe in your bed at night. There are people who think that the law keeps the peace, but the law doesn't keep the peace. The sheriff keeps the peace. Him and his gun. That's how it works. So, but once you call politics by its real name, once you start thinking of it as a local monopoly on violence, then you have to start thinking about it differently. I mean, there's just no way to understand politics that way without thinking about politics differently than you do. And it changes things. So for me, what it did when I really first came to understand that is it provided me with a pretty good principle, I thought, for deciding what government should do and what government shouldn't do. So I developed a kind of rule of thumb, and because my concealed carry permit is not good in New York. I didn't bring a visual aid here. But my rule of thumb is this: if you aren't willing to walk over to your neighbor's house and stick a gun in his face about the issue, then you shouldn't be willing to deputize someone else from the government to walk over to your neighbor's house and stick a gun in his face in the issue in your behalf. It seems to me fairly straightforward. For some reason, my politics here are a minority taste, but I think it's a self-evident good idea. Like practically all of you, I mean, you would use violence sometimes. You'd use a gun to stop someone from breaking into your house and hurting your family or your children. You'd use a gun to stop a stranger, predator from hurting a child, even if you didn't know him. We would use guns to stop a foreign army from occupying these shores. I mean, there are lots of important and legitimate uses for violence. We shouldn't just let that word throw us off. But it does set a pretty high standard, I think, for political action. So let's think about maybe funding for a cowboy poetry festival in Nevada. In some obscure, pissant little town in Nevada that nobody's ever heard of, Harry Reid in the Senate, on our behalf, decided that it was a national priority for the federal government, which has a navy and nuclear weapons, to fund a cowboy poetry festival in rural Nevada. But now we all laugh at this, but think about what this means. He decided that you and you and yes, you and you had to pay for this. And if you don't want to pay for it, well, what's going to happen? Well, we'll come and seize your property and make you pay for it. What if you don't want your property seized? Well, then we're going to put you in a cage. And we're going to put you in a cage until you pay for it. What if I try to stop you from putting me in the cage? Well, then we might shoot you in the face. We're a cowboy poetry festival. Economists have a pretty good definition of what a public good is. And I'll just save you the time by saying that ain't it. That is not what it is. So let's call things by their right names. That's not a public good. It just isn't. Call things by their right names. We have police departments, and I admire police for the most part. A lot of good people in police departments. They employ a lot of brave and courageous folks. I live in New York City, which has probably the country's best big city police department. They do good work. Expensive, though. I mean, we spend a lot of money on these guys, both in the cost of the operations and just in compensation, things like that. I mean, it's a pretty good racket being a New York City cop. There are detectives who make $300,000, $400,000 a year once you count up overtime and benefits and such. So what if I decide that I think this is, it's a good police department, but it's maybe not worth my money? What if I want to go to another vendor to buy my protection because I think they're too expensive? Well, it's a monopoly. You can't do that, right? So the police are the people who are there to protect me from bodily harm and the loss of property. And if I don't give them my money, they will come to my house and inflict upon me loss of property and bodily harm. So call things by their right names. In any other context, that's known as a protection racket. We will protect you, and if you don't pay us 40% of your earnings for the rest of your life, nobody can protect you from us. I lived in Philly for a long time and covering mob trials and stuff there. I never heard of a mafia protection racket that asked for 40%. I'm not much of a religious scholar, but I think God only asked for 10. And, he did more things. But that's politics. And if you look at the origins of the oldest states, particularly in Asia and Europe, you'll find that's how they started for the most part. They were the most successful gang of criminals. They established a monopoly, and then they started giving themselves uniforms and titles and things like that. If you've ever gone to any of the British museums, they've got weapons from around the time when William the Conqueror was invading. And what they really look like more than anything else is the machetes that you'll see in conflicts in places like Haiti and Rwanda. These were not, magnificent knights on horseback and steeds and all that. They were the equivalent of the people who fought the Rwandan Civil War as one. And then they became reputable, because everything becomes reputable if you give it enough time. So I say call things by their right name. You can call it taxation. I call it armed robbery. Tell me I'm wrong. Are they not armed? Are they not taking away stuff I don't want taken away? Are they not doing it for frivolous reasons? So we have advocates of the welfare state, which I'm not, as you may have guessed, and they often congratulate themselves on their generosity and their compassion. And they talk about people like Paul Ryan as being mean and hard-hearted and cruel and such things. But think about the words. I mean, it is literally metaphysically impossible to be generous with somebody else's money. So y'all know the story about me in the theater throwing that cell phone, right? Do I have time for an aside? So I'm at a production of Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, which is this wonderful opera based on war and peace, and there's a woman next to me who's texting all the way through it. And I'm a theater critic, I'm around these people all the time, just sort of used to it. And I asked her to stop because it's really bothering my date, and when your date's bothered, you're bothered. And she was just really rude about it. She had this kind of Jersey voice. And I asked her a couple of times, and she just wouldn't put it away. I took it from her, and I threw it out the door. And I happened to do this on a night that was a critics' night, so it was full of newspaper guys. And so the next day, every newspaper in the English-speaking world had this story. It was in the British papers, and the Australian papers, and the New York Post endorsed me to run for mayor. It was great. Since I don't vote, I thought it might be awkward. But you cannot be generous with other people's money, and you cannot exercise compassion with a gun in your hand. It doesn't work that way, and don't tell me you don't have a gun. You do. If you don't have it yourself, you just deputize someone else to carry the gun for you. That's not compassion, and having someone else do it for you isn't the rule of law. It's not having the guts to do your own dirty work. I feel strongly about that. Which is to say, we've arrived at a really weird place in the evolution of our political language. If someone wants to keep his own property and be left alone, he's greedy. The person who wants to take his property away from him by force is generous. I don't get how you're greedy if you want to mind your own business, but it's generous to covet what other people have and to take it from them by force. It doesn't make any sense. There are people right now who, under the guise of civil rights law, would like to tell you from their offices in Washington, D.C., how you have to run your bakery in rural Colorado, according to their own whims and their own politics and their own preferences. And the people who believe that we call, perversely enough, liberal, which used to mean something else, and now it means the opposite of what it meant. People who want to return us to 1930s-style central planning policies that have their origins in the administration of Bismarck are progressives. What the hell could these words even possibly mean? We can't advance ideas, we can't advance the discussion because we've lost the ability to talk about it. But there are words that mean things still. What you do unto the least of these you do unto me is serious business, and not just for Christians. Love thy neighbor is serious business, and not just for Christians. And the reason we need to think about violent coercion isn't that it doesn't produce real generosity, or real compassion, or real virtue, or real community, but it makes those things impossible. You can't love your neighbor at the point of a bayonet. It doesn't work that way. You can't love a person, you can't love a community, you can't love a country under duress, under force. It just doesn't work that way. So with that in mind, I'd like to leave you with just a little bit more language, and this from T.S. Eliot. Chorus is from The Rock. When the stranger says, "What is the meaning of this city? Do you huddle close together because you love each other?" What will you answer? We all dwell together to make money from each other? Or, this is a community? O my soul, be prepared for the coming of the stranger. Be prepared for him who knows how to ask questions. And the wind will say, here were decent, godless people. Their only monument, the asphalt road, and 1,000 lost golf balls. Thank you for having me. And I'm happy to take whatever questions you have. I think the way we'll do it is just hold up your hand and I will point and yell.
And repeat the question. Maybe.
And maybe repeat the question. And if you start giving a speech, I will cut you off just very rudely. And you'll let me know when the time's up?
Absolutely.
Yes, sir.
Sir.
Let me ask 2 questions.
Yes.
First question is, this is in regard to what I've been taught. I've been taught that the established system of morality and ethics has made it possible to provide stability and permanence to American society. Are you now saying with the degrading of our government that doesn't exist?
I think it would be a grave error to confuse the government and a moral establishment, because it's not one.
Okay, got it. Second question is, as you view the disintegration of our government, would it be fair to say that the middle class value system will recover after this government is gone?
Yeah, thank you. I'll speak to you a little bit more on that one. So part of the subject of my book is about the gradual shrinkage of the footprint of government in our lives. Simply because, as Harry Stein, Ben Stein's father, the economist, said, that which cannot go on won't. It's known as Stein's law in economics. So I don't want to run all the whole numbers thing, but if you look at the long-term assets, liabilities, and cash flow of the United States government, the things it's promised to do over the next 60 years, it's literally impossible it's ever going to happen. The unfunded liabilities of Social Security and Medicare alone are more than the annual output of the entire human race. It's a big number. I'm only 41, but I kind of remember when we first started talking about billions, and that was weird. Now we're talking about trillions, and now it's hundreds of trillions. So, okay, what the federal government does is essentially four things. If you look at where the federal government spends its money, I don't have the 2013 numbers, but as of 2012, 81.5% of spending was four things: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and defense. So that's it. So when people talk about balancing the budget and they say, we're going to cut non-defense discretionary spending, well, congratulations. That's 18.5% of the whole thing, and you're running a 40% deficit, at least we were until fairly recently. So I expect over the long term that a lot of the things we used to look to government to do, we're going to look to other sources to do, particularly things like education that it's just kind of not very good at for the most part, but also things like contract enforcement, personal security, all sorts of things. So that's a part of the thesis of the book, is why I think that's going to unravel and actually leave us better off in the long run. The short version of the argument is that we're a lot better at doing things through markets and cooperatively than we are doing them through government. Who's got a cell phone? Who's got a nice cell phone? Like an iPhone or something? That's good. So, I lecture with college students a lot, and some of them from some poor neighborhoods, and I point them to some of you are old enough to remember the movie Wall Street with Michael Douglas playing a guy called Gordon Gekko, and the visual I always use for them because it just makes them laugh. You remember that cell phone he had? It was the size of a cinder block, and it weighed like 11 pounds, and that's why they called them car phones, because it was the size of your car and you needed one to haul it around. But now here's an interesting fact you youngins won't know, is that in 2013 dollars, that crappy Motorola brick cell phone, which had 22 minutes of talk time and you couldn't play Angry Birds on or send a text, cost $10,000. Cost the equivalent of $10,000 in 1982 dollars or whatever. Cost $1,000 a month to operate it. So you had to be Gordon Gekko to have one. You had to be a millionaire. So, you think about the schools you go to, you think about the kind of health care that people get from things like Medicaid, and I ask you, why does this get better and cheaper every year and your schools suck? And they're really expensive. I lived in Philadelphia, as I said, for a long time, where schools are dangerous and defective and fewer than half the kids graduate in 4 years. And they spend almost as much money per student as they spend at Lower Merion across the street, which has the best public schools in the country, or some of them. So it's not a matter of resources. It's a matter of what you do with them. And the nice thing, and we've got in this with the Clairol touch of yogurt thing, is that markets don't always work. Markets don't always do. And God knows people in private enterprise do stupid things. And they're also just crooks in the world, as Madoffs and things like that. But what markets are really good at is killing stuff. Anybody remember New Coke? It didn't last very long. Because the thing about markets is you can't coerce people. You can't force people to like your Clairol Touch of Yogurt shampoo. You just can't. You can't force people to want new Coke. They just don't buy it. So in markets, as in biology, the mechanism of evolution is death. Products die, firms die, corporations die. If you go back and look at the firms that were the Fortune 500 in 1950 or 1960, I think there's 17 of them that are still on the list. If you look at the firms that were in the original Dow Jones Industrial Average, it's like reading a history book. There aren't there anymore. And interestingly, corporate lifespans are getting shorter because markets are getting larger, the world's more connected, and there's a lot more competition. So it used to be that the average company on the Fortune 100 lasted something like 72 years there, and now it's 12, something like that. 20 years from now, it'll be 6 months. Questions? Yes, sir.
If you had the power to anoint or select a candidate for President of the United States in 2016, who might that be and why?
If I had that power, I would abdicate it. You know, William F. Buckley, the man who founded my magazine, I ran for mayor of New York one time, wrote a wonderful book about it called The Unmaking of a Mayor, and one of his most famous quotes, and he had a lot of them, was people asked him, well, Mr. Buckley, what are you going to do if you win? And he said, demand a recount. You know, I actually don't think it matters that much. I mean, there are people I would prefer to see win and people I'd prefer to see lose, and mostly people I'd prefer to see lose. That's why I'm really looking forward to the Senate elections, not so much because I'm all that excited about having a Republican majority. I mean, okay, rah, rah, whatever, Mitch McConnell. But watching Harry Reid suffer is going to make me happy because I'm a bad person. But, you know, my sort of politics, I mean, obviously the sort of closest guy to my orbit would be Rand Paul. I mean, there are a lot of good guys in the Republican Party. I think Ted Cruz is a good guy. He's a smart guy. Mike Lee, I like a lot. You know, a fair number of guys. But, you know, you're talking about an institutional problem, not an individual problem. And this is something we always run into is we think we can make these institutions work if we only install the right people. Get rid of the bad people and put in the good people. And the depressing thing about Washington that I learned there, working there, is it is full of good people. You know, you expect them to be sort of corrupt and self-serving and all that kind of stuff. And I mean, you get some of that. I mean, Charles Rangel and the ethanol bastards and all those people. But for the most part, Washington's full of, you know, smart, bright, well-intentioned people who try to do good things and bring us stuff like $100 trillion in unfunded liabilities and, you know, a foreign policy that says we're going to drop bombs on Iraqis until the ones that are left are Connecticut. And, you know, it's just, it doesn't work. So we're talking about institutional problems. And frankly, anybody who came out with an honest agenda to even just fix the fiscal stuff would probably be literally crucified. Because I was writing about this today, actually. I talk to people about fiscal stuff a lot because I'm kind of a budget nerd. And you talk to these so-called fiscal conservatives, and I say, well, how do you want to balance the budget? And they say, cut foreign aid. And I'm like, great, that's like $11. You know, there was a poll in the Washington Post a couple years ago. People think foreign aid is a third of our budget. And it's something like 0.0002%, something like that. I was like, you know, it'd be great to get Mohammed Morsi off of welfare, but we had to get your grandma off welfare too. And you can't go telling people that. You can't tell people, hey, congratulations, you paid into Social Security for a long time. It's gone. It was a scam and you got ripped off. FDR lied to you. Sorry. You know, because again, look at what they spend money on. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and defense. You can't balance the budget without cutting those things. And you remember the sequester? Of course you don't remember the sequester because nobody was paying attention because nobody cared. Because you can cut some government spending and the only people complaining about the sequester were who? Military contractors in Northern Virginia. And that's why Republicans moved on that. Because these guys, you know, they write checks and we don't hear them bitch about things. And plus, you know, Virginia's economy depends on this kind of stuff. So, you know, it's really difficult to do that. And the thing I'm optimistic about, though, is that once the money runs out, you don't really have to make those decisions anymore. You know, it's, well, we're cutting now. We're not going to pay you what we told you we were going to pay you because there's literally no money to do it. And the bad potential downside of that, of course, is that, you know, our debt is financed on short-term notes for the most part now. It used to be on 20-year bonds. Now it's mostly on much shorter notes. And interest rates are at historic lows, and they have been for a while. Maybe one or two of you out there remember the 1980s. but for those of you who are a little bit younger, interest rates were 19% at one point on Treasury bonds. So if it goes back up to that, I mean, that's unlikely, but it's happened. That means that just our debt service payments hit a couple $1 trillion a year overnight. If they go back to their average, which is around 7%, something like that, then you're talking about a Pentagon-sized hole in the budget, $1 trillion a year just on debt service, the one thing you actually have to pay. So I hope that doesn't happen, but that's the downside. Incidentally, I know a lot of older people who they missed that part of the 80s because they were all invested in T-bills. And they're like, yeah, I got 20%, it was awesome. And like, but you had to pay 20% on a mortgage too. Yeah, but my house was paid for. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
The abuse of language, it's easy to blame Marxism and things like that for twisting the language around, but where do you trace the root or the origin of the abuse of language where things mean the opposite of what they
Yeah. Was it Gertrude Himmelfarb who said that every society suffers a barbarian invasion every generation in the form of its children? It's true. People are not born civilized. They're not born literate. I mean, we come into this world sort of indistinguishable from chimpanzees except for upper body strength. So we haven't done a good job with educating. I mean, we maybe talk too much in politics about the value of fixing education, but there are some really important things. Economically, people like me, there's no such thing as a recession for people who went to college. Even the worst of the recession, the unemployment rate for college graduates never hit 5%. But we try to educate everybody as though a liberal arts education is their future when maybe they want to do something else like, be pipe fitters or learn how to fix cars or things like that. And I don't know if my mechanic makes a lot more money than I do, I'm pretty sure. But there are things that could really be improved by fixing education. One of those is getting people who aren't going to be going to law school and graduate school and into academic and intellectual sort of jobs, skills for good careers, which would make a huge difference in their lives and also improve the economy, but also maybe make better citizens, which is the whole idea of a liberal education in the first place. I mean, it's why we call it the liberal arts, right? It's the idea that it's an education that makes you fit for liberty. And we don't get a lot of that anymore. I went to the University of Texas, which is a fine school in a lot of ways, and for $850 a semester, you can't beat it. It's what it was back then. Anyway, eat your hearts out. But does it educate people for citizenship? Does it educate them to be free men and free women? Well, hell no, it doesn't. It educates them to be government workers and dependents and, well, engineers, which are awesome. Next. Yes, sir.
I have a comment. I grew up in the 1930s, 1940s, and we had trade schools, high schools, where we trained pipe fitters, we trained the electricians, we trained the machinists, and we had all that sort of education going on. Very few of us went to college. I was one of the lucky ones that did go to college, okay? And, but college graduates were a rarity. And these people provided us with, and they earned good wages for what they did. Where did we go wrong?
Yeah, George Will, I think, who remarked that 60 years ago we taught our high school students Greek and Latin, and now we teach our college students remedial English. College became something other than an education. It became a credential. It became a ticket. It was your ticket to the good life, right? So people went into college for years thinking it doesn't matter what I do, what I major in, what I learn. I get a college degree, I come out, I get a good job. So we take, instead of, the most academically inclined 5% or 8% of your students, and you send 70% of them there. You get a lot of women's studies majors, and people who are not going to be there to learn anything useful. And of course, you've got people who don't want to teach anything useful either. Colleges are just, they're great big sinecures full of useless people teaching other people to be useless. I'm a journalist, and I can't believe, to save my life, that there is such a thing as a 4-year degree in journalism. Are you kidding me? You know, journalism is something you go work at a newspaper for 6 months and hey, you're a journalist, congratulations. There's not enough material there to make a 4-year degree out of. I'm mystified by the fact that there are 4-year undergraduate degrees in business. What do? Come out. You're 22, you have a degree in business, run my company, you know nothing. I mean, some things make sense, like, you know, accounting, there's specific stuff you gotta learn. You know, there are specific standards and practices and things you gotta learn. The arts make sense. I mean, the arts are a lifetime apprenticeship of which formal education is a part. Literature, I think, you know, what I did anyway, worth studying. There are books worth reading. But, you know, it's a scam. And it's a scam that people get away with because it's not your own money on the line. You know, if you actually had to pay the cost of sending a student to the University of Texas, UT is very cheap because you don't pay for it, right? Because your tuition is about 11% of the actual cost of educating you. And UT is spending something like, you know, $75,000 or $80,000 per student per year. You would not put up with the ridiculous stuff this university does if you were paying that much money out of your pocket. If you pay for your own cell phones, you don't let them get worse every year and more expensive. You want them to get better and less expensive. But education, there's no market there. There's no choice. It's a monopoly almost everywhere. 94% of students are in government monopoly schools, K through 12. Most of the ones that go to college go to government colleges, where they're taught the predictable ideology that keeps these places in business. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I was wondering, can you talk about failed states? Can you see any advantage in having countries like Somalia?
Nope. No, look, you know, I spent time in Pakistan, which at the time was not quite a failed state, but it's not, you know, it's not California either, which is going to be a failed state too, but whole other story. You know, I've covered the Indian Parliament and the Philadelphia City Council, and the worst politicians I've ever seen in my life were the San Bernardino City Council. I actually yelled at them after their meeting. I was people are embarrassment. But no, I mean, the problem is, you know, you want to transition from these politics-dominated monopoly systems that don't work, don't evolve, don't improve, don't produce real benefits, to cooperative, whether that means nonprofit or market-oriented for-profit systems that actually produce the sort of results you want to produce. But getting from A to B can be really difficult. And you don't want to get from A to B in a way that looks like Somalia or Haiti or a place like that. So no First Amendment and a government that protected his property rights, or the other way around, he would take the property rights. Places with property rights are stable. Places with property rights have resources, and it takes resources to solve social problems. I mean, the reason we had poor people and children working in factories and people hungry on the streets in places like Victorian England wasn't because they didn't have a welfare state. It wasn't because people were mean, it's because they were poor. They just didn't have enough to go around. You know, if you look at the chart of economic growth in human history, for 10,000 years, it moves upward like at 1 degree. You know, it's nothing, 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 nothing. Ooh, agriculture. Nothing, 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 nothing. And then, you know, in the early 1700s, it goes, boom. You know, it's a 45-degree angle, and it goes up ever since. And that's the Industrial Revolution. That's what actually changed the world. People weren't poor and miserable in medieval England because they were superstitious and religious and because they were being oppressed by their kings, even though they kind of were. They were miserable because they were poor. And it took a while for the Industrial Revolution to produce the sort of resources that we now have to spread around and do the things we do. I mean, the good news about a place like the United States is we're not a poor country. We're not ever going to be a poor country unless we decide to be a poor country. We don't want to be vulnerable. We don't want to be hungry. We don't want to be miserable. If you look at our serious social problems, healthcare being one of them, education being one of them, mental illness being one that we don't talk about nearly enough. I mean, we don't really have a homelessness problem in America. We have a mental illness problem. We just kicked them all out of the hospitals and put them on the streets into your libraries. And these problems are not that hard to solve in terms of resources. We've got a lot of money and a lot of resources to throw at these problems. The problem is the welfare state model is trying to solve these problems out of current income. So if you want to support a whole bunch of poor families, and let's face it, we're going to have to do that, welfare state or not. Some people just can't take care of themselves, and we're nice, we're not going to let them starve to the street. There are people who are mentally retarded or mentally ill, or their children. You're not going to let them not be taken care of. But if you try to take care of all those people out of just current income, it gets really expensive. It would be like, you trying to support your 30-year-old kids, which some of you probably are thanks to the current state of the economy, while paying off your own mortgage and all the rest of it. But there's a big difference between doing that and having an asset-based system, which is where you save and set aside resources that have real returns and compound over time to solve these problems. The tragedy is that we started building what's now the welfare state around the end of the Depression, and then more aggressively in the Johnson years. And we have now spent $1.5 trillion or something. We've spent more than $100,000, and probably closer to $200,000 for every person who is or has been poor since we declared war on poverty in 1964-65 in the Johnson administration. So we could have given every poor person $250,000 and sent them on their way and be better off financially, and they'd certainly be better off than we are right now. Our poverty rate's the same now as it was then. So we haven't made too much progress on this, and it's because we're going about this the wrong way. So one thing libertarians really go wrong on is, we say, oh, the market will take care of it, or private charity will take care of it. Well, that's great, and I believe that's true, but what's that look like? Because people, they know what Social Security looks like, and so they're not going to give it up until they have to, because it's a check, it's going to come. But there are always going to be problems that you can't just have some sort of, atomistic Ayn Rand individual standard for, because not everyone's capable. We just know this. There are 4-year-olds in the world. Some of them have terrible parents. Someone has to do something about this, and it costs money. It takes real resources to do that. So it's not really a question of, can we afford to do these things? Of course we can afford to do these things. We spend $1 billion a year on bubblegum. More than that, actually. We spend $1 billion a year just on Broadway plays in this country. So, God knows what we spend on like a big industry like, rap music or something like that, It's not a question of resources. It's a way to say that again. Are we getting close to needing done, or we got more time?
A couple more.
Okay. I'd be happy to take, in the back, sir, yes.
Is the government also powerful? We have all these problems, we need all this money. There was an idea floating around. Why can't they just get a bag full of $1 trillion coins and tell the world this is it?
Do you seriously want me to answer that question? Okay, so Econ 101, we got supply and demand. And demand curves slope downward. So when you print a lot of money, you get inflation, and you don't solve your problems. Although it's very likely at some point we will just kind of pull in Argentina and say, that's some nice bonds you got there. Might try recycling. I just came back from Puerto Rico, which is probably on the verge of doing that with a lot of its sovereign debt. They just did a thing that should always scare you, which is they just sold a bunch of bonds to pay off their old bonds. So you're using the credit card to pay off the credit card sort of thing. Terrible, terrible mess. Beautiful place, nice weather. Yes, ma'am.
My concern with the Affordable Care Act, which I think is also an interesting choice of words, is that
Orwell would have approved.
that some will look at the challenges and say, oh, well, this is why we need single payer, government supported, as opposed to looking at it and saying, no, we have an all-you-can-eat buffet for the rest of your life healthcare system. Yeah.
People on the single payer thing, I just always ask people, in what other places in life do you think a monopoly is a good idea? No one really ever answers that, I don't think. The funny thing about the Affordable Care Act, and again, I don't want to sound too bitter about this. I think the people who designed it meant well. I mean, they were basically trying to recreate the Swiss system here, and the Swiss system's not bad, as such things go. Except, America's not full of Swiss people. It's full of Americans, which is kind of a problem. But, so I was talking to my doctor the other day about the Affordable Care Act, and my doctor's funny because he's kind of a lefty guy, but he's also sort of a conspiracy theorist, and he's been Googling me. And so I'm into my doctor, and he's like, so why'd they murder Andrew Breitbart? Okay, whatever. So I was asking him about the ACA, and he loves the Affordable Care Act. He thinks it's the best thing ever. I said, why do you like it? Well, it imposes some standardization on insurance companies. So certain tests and things like that have to be covered. So it used to take him, maybe a couple of days or a couple of weeks to get something approved, and now he gets it approved, it's just a matter of minutes because it's standard and has to be done and everyone's insurance is the same. And well, okay, that's great. And I asked him, well, how does that affect your own dealings with insurance companies? He doesn't take insurance. He's cash on the barrelhead. So of course he loves it. He didn't deal with these guys. I mean, he has to, send stuff out for outside tests sometimes, and he'll send the patient stuff into the insurance company for them. But him dealing with that, I would walk in, hand him the American Express card, tell me when it's going to be. And frankly, that's a better way to do medicine. I mean, we do everything else in the world that way. I mean, can you imagine trying to buy shoes the way you buy healthcare, where your employer decides for you what kind of shoes you like and gives you a couple of choices, and then has to figure out the average size that's needed for the company? It doesn't make any sense. The thing some of you may notice, some of you have jobs, and the lucky ones. And the lucky ones among you who have jobs know that your financial interests and your employer's financial interests are not always precisely the same. But he gets to buy your health care for you, which I'm thinking maybe he's looking at his interests, maybe a little more than yours. It's a profoundly dumb system. I mean, the reason we have employer-based health care goes back to the Depression and FDR imposing wage and price control, so you couldn't give people raises. It was against the law. R.C. Hoyle, one of my favorite people in the world, is the newspaper man, the founder of the Orange County Register, almost went to jail for giving his staff a raise. Dared FDR to arrest him, they wouldn't do it. So instead of having that, we got what's known as the fringe benefit, which is insurance plans and things like that. We changed the tax code to advantage that, so it's much less expensive from a tax perspective now to have an employer-based plan than buy one on your own. But other than that, it's a profoundly dumb system. It's just an idiotic way of doing things. Your coworkers and you probably don't have the same kinds of cars, the same kinds of televisions, or anything like that. Some of you are going to be older, some of you are going to be younger, some of you are going to have different health needs and different interests. And it doesn't make any sense for all of you to buy it together. And it's not like you're stupid, right? I mean, we go out and we negotiate things like complicated cell phone contracts and cars, and you can fly to Singapore and stop over in, Frankfurt and figure it all out and do the currency exchange and all that. And we're telling you can't figure out your own health care because mostly it's, you go get a flu shot and a checkup once a year. And then when it gets to be something bad, you're not really in charge anyway. You're not going to be like shopping around about heart transplants too much. You're probably going to try to trust a professional on that one and maybe not get a cut rate deal. But there's no reason that healthcare should be as expensive as it is. And that's the thing why we have all this political pressure for healthcare reform, because people are terrified of it, right? Last time my mother was in the hospital before she passed away, she was in the hospital for almost 3 weeks, I want to say. And she had to have dialysis, and she'd had an infection and some various other things. So, she comes out of the hospital, and her last hospital bill is $325,000. And of course, she worked for the government, so taken care of. Nice thing about working in a public job, you get great health care. That's why Breaking Bad never would have happened in the real world, right? Because Walter White was a teacher. Well, which doctor do you want? Go. So people are afraid of that sort of thing. But, you can buy a car that isn't priced like a Rolls Royce. You can spend as much money as you want on a car, or you can buy a Honda Civic. A Honda Civic is a lot more complicated than most healthcare transactions are, but you can still afford one. So it's just a question of not allowing markets to do their thing and not allowing markets to work. I mean, the only way to solve scarcity problems is through abundance, right? It's to make things ubiquitous and cheap. In the 1950s, the average American family spent almost half of its take-home income on groceries. Food was really expensive. But we got better at it. Thank you, Monsanto and other people. And we cleared more farmland. We put GPS in tractors to make them more efficient and all that, and food became very cheap. So now we eat out more in a week than our grandparents did in a year typically. We've got access to better food. You ever read The Count of Monte Cristo? One of my favorite books, and there's a scene in it where the Count has his dinner party in Paris. And he's this elusive, eccentric gazillionaire. And he shocks and delights his guests by serving them 2 different kinds of fish that come from different parts of the world. And there's a whole page about this, and people, well, how did you do this? And he goes on about all the money he had to spend and, you know, hiring an Arab caravan to bring it across the desert and all this. You know, you can kind of go into Walmart and get 2 kinds of fish and afford it, and probably better fish, you know, for the most part, and it's not going to have been sitting in a jar in a camel caravan somewhere. But even if you go back and read, you know, books from the 1970s, 1980s, you'll find evidence of that stuff. It's occasionally just shocking. There's a bit in Stephen King's The Stand where this guy who's become a rock star goes home to visit his working class mom in the Bronx. And he notices that she's bought 2 pounds of butter because she plans to cook for him. And he wonders, you know, how was she ever able to afford that? This is a real extravagance for her. Has anyone in this room ever thought twice about buying a pound of butter? I mean, okay, maybe some of you are old enough to have, but it's just not that way anymore. You did?
I'm old enough.
Yeah. I had artificial poverty in college, you know, it was a lot of ramen noodles and such, but that's spending it on, you know, liquor. But, we'll do one more question then?
You kind of answered it already.
Okay.
I just wanted to say I feel the same about 401s as people about the Affordable Care Act. The same way, why we don't get to choose that.
Yeah, it's...
You get to do this much. Oh yeah, by the way, we're in charge of it.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I don't want my employer in charge of my retirement especially. I mean, National Review, I love my employer. But yeah, especially if you're working someplace like some big company with 100,000 employees, you know, you probably need more choices than they can do. One last one, or shall we let it go?
Yeah, maybe.
I guess you're in the back.
You said a minute ago that conditions for, I guess, impoverished individuals hasn't changed much over the years.
I said the poverty rate hasn't changed. No, conditions certainly have changed. Yeah.
Yeah, poverty rate. So, and you also say that it's not about resources.
Yes.
I have 2 questions. Who are the poor, in your opinion, and what contributes to the mission? Repeat the question.
He wanted to know, in my opinion, who's poor and why do we misuse the resources that are supposed to be used to help them? Well, in one sense, nobody is poor. I mean, not in the United States, not by world standards. You know, go to rural India, there's poor people. You don't really see that here. And to the extent that you do see people here who are doing things like sleeping on the street, it's mostly a mental illness issue, an addiction issue, rather than a financial issue. So, I mean, you can define poverty all sorts of ways. I mean, we typically define it just in relative terms, you know, people at the bottom 10% of wealth and income, people at the bottom 20% of wealth and income, whatever. I forget what the current official poverty rate is because it's some meaningless federal statistic that they just make up as they go along. But, so, you know, who is poor? Well, in a sense, nobody in the United States. But the people I think of and the people I'm talking about here are people who want their lives to be materially very different than they are and don't have the resources to make that happen and don't have the ability to get those resources. So, you know, sometimes you're talking about the, you know, famous able-bodied adult of political rhetoric. Sometimes you're talking about people who, for one reason or another, are not going to become that able-bodied adult. And it's always hard stuff to talk about, but, you know, some people aren't that smart. And it's a hard world right now for people who are below average IQ. I'm not talking about mentally retarded people. I'm talking about people who just, you know, aren't that bright. It's a tough market for them because the sorts of jobs that they used to do and they used to be good at are exactly the ones that are going to get outsourced. And they're the ones that have to compete with people in India and China and Bangladesh and Pakistan and places like that. You know, not doctors, not teachers, not people like that. So it's difficult. And the reason that the resources get misused are a couple. One thing that I don't have time to go in too much, but you should definitely read about it, it's probably the most important idea in politics in the 20th century, which comes from an economist called Ludwig von Mises, and it's what he called the calculation problem. So in a situation in which you have economic resources but no competitive market, you don't have any prices. And without prices, you have no way to make rational decisions about the allocation of resources because you don't know where they're wanted and where they're not wanted. Yeah, I like the case of the grocery store. So I go to my local Whole Foods in New York, and I started counting up different kinds of milk. You know, so they got gallon containers and half-gallon containers and pints, and there's whole milk and skim milk and 1% and 1.5%. And, you know, the various permutations. There's organic, of course, and all these things. So I figured, okay, typical family goes to the store once a week. they buy milk. And I set myself some parameters. So some of them are going to be vegans because they're shopping at Whole Foods and they don't buy any milk. And some of them are going to be having birthday parties and making ice cream, and they're going to buy 5 gallons of milk. So I gave them that range, possibility. So you run all the different options of, is it 1%, is it from here, is it organic, is it what? Are we buying 1 gallon, are we buying 2 gallon? You just consider all the possible distributions for the 115 million households in the United States of a simple product like milk. Well, the number you come up with for the number of possible variations is a lot larger than the number of seconds that have passed since the Big Bang. It's a huge number. So when politicians say about something complicated like healthcare, we're going to consider all the options. We're going to consider all the information. No, you aren't. If you did nothing else with a team of supercomputers and genius monkeys for the rest of your life, you wouldn't get 1% of the way there. So they guess. And they, of course, they have their own interests as well. There's no reason we have farm subsidies. There's no economic reason in the United States at all, no defensible reason for farm subsidies. Why we have farm subsidies? Farmers want farm subsidies, and they're better organized than you are. There's no reason to be subsidizing banks and bailing them out. There's no reason for a lot of things we do, but people with power can cause things to happen their way. I guess in closing, and again, I don't think corruption is the problem per se, because there really aren't that many corrupt people in American government. It's a little more corrupt than, say, Canada, but it's not as corrupt as Russia. Yeah, how do you define corruption? That I was living in India. They say an honest politician is the one who takes your bribe and then does the thing you paid him to do. But that sort of self-interest, whether it's illegal stuff like people skimming and awarding their friends contracts, or whether it's stuff that's totally legal, like passing appropriations for your friend's cowboy poetry festival in Nevada. People who distrust the market think, well, people are selfish, right? People are self-interested, and people in capitalist markets are looking out for their own interests. And it's true, people are selfish. They don't magically become non-selfish when you elect them president or when you send them to Congress. So people operating in politics, whether they're police captains, public school superintendents, presidents of the United States, whatever, they have their own sets of interests too. There's a whole set of economics dedicated to studying this. It's called public choice theory, associated with a guy called Buchanan at George Mason University. And so if you really want to read up on why these systems not only don't work, but can't work, and in fact can't even work in principle, if you look at it from a strictly logical modeling point of view, then yeah, look up Mises and look up public choice theory. And it's kind of the basic intellectual groundwork that'll get that for you. So I'd love to sign some books. Thank you all for coming. And I'll talk to anybody else.